So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Maureen Folk. I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. And thanks for joining us for our next talk in our series, Conversations with the Past. This series is held on the second Wednesday of each month, so be sure to check out our website if you want more details. So I have asked all of you to mute. I do also want to say that we are recording this program so that we can post it onto our website. And so if you, or onto our YouTube. So if you want to turn off your camera, you can do that. If anyone needs help muting, I'm happy to do that. So tonight we are lucky to have our very own Executive Director, Tim Weidner, who will be retiring in just a couple weeks. Tim graduated with his master's from the Cooperstown Museum Studies program. He then spent 10 years of his career at the Roberson Museum and Science Center in Binghamton, New York.
Okay, well, I'm not hearing anything.
We have been lucky enough to have Tim as the Executive Director of the Chapman Museum for the past 23 years, during which he has led countless projects, exhibits, books, and talks. And so please join me in welcoming Tim for his talk, Halfway Brook, Small Stream, Big Story. And I apologize, I just I pinned you. So I thought it would work for the screen sharing, but what is everybody seeing on their screen? Can one person let me know what they're seeing on their screen?
Halfway Brook.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see
And
Tim
there's a
in the
little
corner.
picture of
Tim is
Tim
in the corner
Weidner on
and
the
Halfway
right.
Brook.
Okay, Tim is in the corner. Great.
Yep.
All right. So I am going to mute the people who are unmuted, and then I'm going to ask that Tim can begin.
Just give me a thumbs up.
Anytime you're ready, go ahead.
Well, as a way of a preface for the talk I'll be doing this evening, I just want to explain that for most projects, I find them a project of discovery, exploration. When I started out doing research on Halfway Brook many months ago, I knew a few basic things. I knew that Halfway Brook went through the area. I knew it was part of the watershed. I had heard the story about George Washington stopping and getting a drink somewhere on Halfway Brook or a tributary, and had heard some stories about there had been skirmishes during the French and Indian War, but that was about all I knew at that time. So when I started out, I was starting out with just a few basic facts, and over the next few months, I found as many things as I could. As a matter of fact, even today, as I was wrapping up my notes for the program, I was finding new things that I didn't know about. The one plus of that is that we'll get to discover a lot of things together. The downside is that I never have all the research done. In fact, some of the things that I found today, I know very little about, but I'll share what little I've been able to find, and it may be something that you'll want to pursue yourself. So with that, let me get started. Halfway Brook, Small Stream, Big Story. Well, I hope to explore both sides of that title today. And what I'm going to start with is a little explanation of where does Halfway Brook go. And I have an interesting quote from 1905 by James Austin Holden, where he says, "It may be truly said that no stream in the Adirondack wilderness is more noted in history and the annals of the border than this, whose appellation, Halfway, comes from the fact it was nearly equidistant from Fort Edward on the south and Fort William Henry on the north. Rising in the branch of the Palmerton Range known as the Luzerne Mountains, west of Glens Falls, running a crooked but generally easterly and northerly course, now expanding into small lakes or basins, now receiving the waters of numerous small tributaries, ponds, and rivulets, It divides the town of Queensbury into two parts, passes the Kingsbury line, turns in a northerly direction, and empties into Wood Creek at a point about 3/4 of a mile south from Battle Hill at Fort Anne in Washington County. Well, this is a much more recent map, actually, probably less than 10 years old, that shows the route of Halfway Brook, starting at one of its westerlymost points, Wilkie Reservoir, and running over through Queensbury and Fort Anne to end up where it empties into now Champlain Canal. What I want to point out today, though, is that it's not just a simple, I can't say straight line, you see it squiggles all over the place, but the actual watershed of Halfway Brook is far more extensive. And what I'm going to do for the first part of our program is actually travel around and show you some of those other sources of Halfway Brook, some of the tributaries, and to give you an idea of where all it goes, where it comes from. We'll start from Wilkie Reservoir as part of the Glens Falls watershed, man-made body of water located up on the mountain. And it's part of the mountain range that runs north-south through the area and provides elevation for water to flow downhill as it heads towards the ocean. The next stop downstream from the reservoir is Wilkie Intake, which is where the water is collected for the Glens Falls watershed. From there, it passes under West Mountain Road, a very small stream at this point. And some people may be familiar with this. It flows through the watershed that basically is between Potter Road and Piggy Ann Road in Queensbury, now accessible by the Halfway Brook Trail that opened in 2020. The brook flows into Halfway Brook Reservoir. And from there makes its way through Coles Woods. It goes under Dixon Road by the pump house. And this is not a recent photo, as you can guess, but I thought it was particularly charming, showing the kid maybe fishing off the stream bank. And here, the Halfway Brook passes under Route 9 by the Enterprise dealership across the street from Price Chopper. You can see that is gained a little in size at this point. There's a sign that's located there that identifies Halfway Brook. It's one of a few that point out its significance during the colonial wars of the 18th century, particularly the French and Indian War. There was a blockhouse that was located on the west or northerly side of what is now Route 9 that played an important role in those events. From there, it flows north. It's not pictured here actually because it's mostly covered with vegetation at this point, but it follows along next to Hovey Pond as it heads towards Quaker Road. Here are a couple pictures of it as it goes along beside Quaker Road. I have never paid much attention to this, but I thought it was fascinating to see the stream as it crosses. The one picture on the left is looking west from Bay Road, and the other photo is looking east from that driveway that you can enter from Quaker Road to the Lowe's parking lot and the Applebee's restaurant. Still quite small stream. then heads northeast, crosses Meadowbrook Road, and then passes through what is actually a large green space and comes out on Ridge Road. Here's a picture of where Halfway Brook comes out. It's at the bottom of the hill, as here we're looking south, but you can see that the county has just been doing a public works project here, improving the road. I don't know whether it was actually specifically a bridge project, but on the left-hand side there, you see a small steam engine. And from the condition of the road, you can tell that they've been doing some grading. Maybe they were improving the run up to the bridge. Here's the location where there actually was a controversial sign for a few years when at one point the state put up a sign that read Halfway Creek. And of course, local people didn't find that acceptable. And after, I think it took 4 years to get it changed back to Halfway Brook. It's interesting, though, if you look at early maps, often, particularly in Washington County, it's called Halfway Creek. And pretty consistently, Google Maps uses Halfway Creek. So they haven't caught up yet. Here you can see that as the stream crossed through Queensbury, it's gained some capacity. There's certainly more volume here as it passes under the bridge on Ridge Road. What I'm going to do now is go back and pick up another one of the tributaries for Halfway Brook. And here we go up to Butler Pond, which is located on the mountain north of Wilkie Reservoir. It also is now part of the Glens Falls watershed. When it was first included, they had to do a fair amount of dredging because it was largely a marsh, which if I look at some of the early maps, flowed north as much as it did south. But here it's much more like a lake now. But what we're going to follow is the stream as it heads down the east side of the mountain. It crosses under Buckby Road. And next enters Butler Storage Reservoir, which is located near the Van Dusen Preserve, which is a real popular hiking and biking destination in the area. But I will point out that the watershed is not open to public use. It is posted. So a lot of activities that a lot of people like to do are prohibited, including trespassing. And I thought I'd just point that out for those of you that think, oh, I want to go check that out. The natural flow from the brook from Butler Pond actually flows into Rush Pond, which was that was a surprise to me, but the maps definitely show that. And this is an area that you can explore. There's a great trail that you can follow and see the waters as they slowly work their way through Rush Pond. Let me catch up with my notes. This is another source for one of the tributaries for Halfway Brook. It's usually just called Mill Pond. It's a small body of water on the north side of Route 149 in French Mountain. It's a busy area. I don't recommend stopping there to check it out. I've actually pulled this off of Google, as you can see. And From here, that tributary flows south, crosses under Route 149, and makes its way eventually to Glen Lake. Here you can see where it passes under Glen Lake Road. I included this a vintage postcard, I guess we'd call it, because it gives you a sense of the bigger picture. It shows Round Pond in the foreground and then Glen Lake behind it. And these waters generally flow from west to east and eventually make their way into Halfway Brook. And I've picked out a few places here where the brook does cross roads. This is Walk Up Road between Glen Lake and Dream Lake. Sunnyside is not actually connected to the stream here, which was a surprise to me, and found out that Sunnyside actually flows underground and flows to the south, and eventually does connect with Halfway Brook at a different location. But I'd always assumed that it was connected to the stream that the outlet from Glen Lake, but no, it's not. Even further north is another source. This is Bear Pond, which is near the top of French Mountain. This is private property. It's not something that you can just walk up to. This photograph I borrowed from Mike Arthur, who had got permission to go there. And the water from Bear Pond flows south, enters into Dream Lake. Here it is at Dream Lake Road. And here is where the outlet from Glen Lake and Dream Lake eventually make it to Ridge Road. It's the crossing is at the bottom of the hill, just north of Oneida Corners, known as Factory Hill. When you look at the volume of water going through there, it's kind of hard to believe that it actually powered mills, but it did. There were a couple of them at this location over time. And then a little further to the east, we come to the bridge on Sunnyside East. And from there, it enters into Washington County. One of the first places one comes to is Patton Mills. As the name suggests, there were mills here. There's actually, I have another photograph which shows there was a fairly significant drop there, which provided power for the mills. As we'll see in Washington County, the stream slows down and it starts meandering. You'll see that it goes all over the place in the next few stops. Here's a photo taken from Farley Road. And we have to stop again and go north again to pick up another one of the tributaries. In this case, it's Sly Pond, where Camp Wackpomony is located. The stream flows south from the small lakes that are located in that area. Everybody's probably, if they've traveled to the area, they've seen Buttermilk Falls Road. And of course, the question I've had for years is, where is Buttermilk Falls? I assumed if there was a road named after it, it must have been quite the attraction. But in actuality, it's all on private land. This is a photograph that I actually got from a realtor photograph for the property that was listed at the time, showing the falls in the back of their property. The stream coming down from the north eventually makes its way into Hadlock Pond. We're not quite there yet, though. Let's go back up north and pick up Inman Pond, which is located southeast of Buck Mountain. And it flows via Bishop Brook, which covers quite a bit of territory in that area, eventually making its way to Hadlock Pond. Lake Nebo, one of the larger lakes in that region of sort of northwestern Fort Anne. It too flows south into Hadlock Pond. We're finally there. And then flowing south out of Hadlock Pond, it continues as Bishop Brook, which is one of the major tributaries of Halfway Brook. Passes under Route 149, and here it's passed under Goodman Road, which it does more than once, as we'll discover. Here you can see the water is definitely still going slow. It's browner, murky, must have been after some spring rains. This is just west of Fort Anne. Crosses Goodman Road again. And this is north of the town. I included these vintage postcards of Halfway Brook as it's about to reach its end, just to give an idea of its sort of lazy nature at this point. Which is right before it goes over Canes Falls, which is a pretty significant drop of about 80 feet. To rejoin or to join Wood Creek, which is where it would have gone originally. Now it empties into the Champlain Canal. So we've spent some time exploring where Halfway Brook goes. We can see it, yes, even as it reaches its end, it has a big drop, but it's not a big river by any means. It's still a fairly small body of water. And what I'd like to do now is switch over and start talking about the big story, the other part of our talk this evening. I thought this is a fascinating map because it includes everything from essentially New York City to Canada in 3 parts. And yet, if we zoom in on it, we'll find some interesting detail. During the French and Indian War, the stream played a very important role because it was the scene of a lot of activity. Everything from small skirmishes to fort building to larger battles. It was involved in a lot of events over a period of several years. In 1905, James Holden, the person I quoted before, also said, in choosing as its first subject for memorial marker, which is they were in the process of doing, the Halfway Brook, the New York State Historical Association has made a dignified and wise selection, for it may be truly said, as I said before, no stream has played a more significant role in the Adirondacks. Perhaps an overstatement, but that was the focus of their project, so I guess they're allowed to say that. If we zoom in on this photograph to one little detail of it, we'll actually see that Halfway Brook is identified. It starts sort of in the middle, just south of the southern tip of Lake George, and you can see it progressing primarily to the right in an easterly direction to Fort Anne. I just was amazed that this detail was included in a map of this scale. It was done a couple of years after the conclusion of those events. And so by that point, it is being called Halfway Brook. However, It was called by many names during the course of the French and Indian War battles and other activities. And I will share a few of them with you. I see I've listed them, but I'll try to give a little bit more information about them. On an old undated map date in the New York State Library, it is noted as Shoon Creek, which may be just a sort of phonetic spelling of something similar. The Earl of Loudoun's map in 1757 has it marked as Forks Creek. And the reason for that is if you're traveling south on Wood Creek, you come to a fork, and you can choose to either continue on Wood Creek or you can head west and follow Halfway Brook. Rogers, the famous ranger, called it Bloody Brook. In Colonel James Matresser's journals in 1757, it is Halfway Run. On the Robert Harper map, it is called Scown Creek, I'm guessing on the pronunciation, while Knox's military journal shows it as 7 Mile Creek due to its location on the military road, or the wagon road as it is called in this map. In Wilson's Orderly Book of Amherst Expedition in 1759, it is laid down as Shone Creek, slightly different spelling. There is a Powderhorn map made by one John Taylor in 1765, a few years after those events, where there's a blockhouse clearly defined at half BR, abbreviation for Brook, between Fort Edward and Lake George. And on later maps, such as this one, which was published around 1778, it bears the popular name of Halfway Brook, which becomes the common usage for the stream. I mentioned a moment ago that the New York State Historical Association was in the process of starting to create historical markers for important places in New York State. And they started with Halfway Brook and enlisted a group of local individuals that were keenly interested in the history of the area to do the research and to write up what would not only go on the marker that you can see on the right-hand side here, but also in a publication of the Historical Association. The marker was actually positioned near the intersection of what we now call Route 9 or Glen Street and Glenwood Avenue. And it stood there for a long period of time before being relocated to Hubby Pond Park. The illustration that you see on the left has a couple markers on it that point out where they believe some of the important fortifications were located in earlier times. I should point out that already many decades had passed since those events. So they were working from sort of limited written materials that they had that were published and available, but also some local recordings of people in their later years trying to identify where things were. By this time, there was no actual physical evidence. Things that had been made out of wood that many years previously would have long ago rotted away or had been hauled away to be used for some other construction project. But they did try to identify where the blockhouse was located, which would have been on the west side of Route 9 or Glen Street, and north of the stream. So somewhere in that area between Halfway Brook and Price Chopper. For those of you that live in the area and know where that is. There was also a fortification, sort of a glorified stockade, perhaps, that was located on the east side of Halfway Brook, as well as what they refer to as the garrison grounds. And you'll notice the local streets that are named for these two things, Fort Amherst and Garrison, in those streets that are actually quite close to Halfway Brook. The stream was significant because it was a resting point for troops. Sir William Johnson had put through the military road or the wagon road between Fort Edward and Lake George, so they could easily both move troops and supplies to Lake George to use for their campaigns further north. It was a place where troops would stop to rest. They could get water there. It was about halfway, so it made sense. A lot of them would end up spending the night there. And they built the fortifications to offer themselves some protection because it was also a place that invited ambush. So it was very strategic. James Holden's history of Queensbury includes one, I think, rather incredible story, which I will share with you. It's not real long. It takes place on July 27th, 1758. A baggage train of 60 carts loaded with flour, pork, wine, rum, etc., each cart drawn by 2 or 3 yoke of oxen, accompanied by an unusually large escort of troops, was dispatched from Fort Edward to the head of Lake George to supply the troops of General Abercrombie, who lay encamped at that point. This party halted for the night at the stockade post at the Halfway Brook. As they resumed their march in the morning, and before the escort had fairly cleared the picketed enclosure, they were suddenly attacked by a large party of French and Indians, which lay concealed in the thick bushes and reeds that bordered the stream, and lined the road on both sides along the lowlands between the blockhouse and the Blind Rock. Putnam's company of Rangers, which had camped at the flats near the southern spur of French Mountain, were aroused from their slumbers by the sound of heavy firing, which they heard coming from a southerly direction. They hastened to the scene of action, a distance of about 4 miles, but arrived only in time to find the slaughtered carcasses of some 250 oxen, the mangled remains of the soldiers, women, and teamsters, and the broken fragments of the 2-wheeled carts. The provisions and stores had been plundered and destroyed. Among the supplies was a large number of boxes of chocolate which had been broken open and their contents strewed upon the ground, which, dissolving in the fervid heat of the summer sun, mingled with the pools and rivulets of blood, forming a sickening and revolting spectacle. Sort of typical language I find in reading these accounts of some of the battle scenes from that time period. Certainly, I'm sure there was blood, but hyperbole is a bit much. But that's an example of one of the major battles that occurred in the Halfway Brook area. There were a number of them. I'm not going to outline them all. If it's something that's of particular interest to you, one thing you can read is the Halfway Brook article that I quoted from is actually available online. If it's something you really want, I can always provide a link and email it to you. Just email me and I'll be glad to do that. Of course, there are a lot of other things that have been written since then having to do with the battles in this region. I mentioned that because another enthusiast in addition to Holden's, was Harriet Bentley, who one of her missions was to really popularize the history of the area, in particular the events of the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars. She was a writer, she was a photographer, she created postcards like the 2 that you see here, one of which includes some of her poetry about Halfway Brook. And then here on the right-hand side, you see a picture looking at what would have been Hovey Pond, I believe, in Glenwood Avenue in an earlier form. I mentioned that the monument was moved. This is a monument that's now in a part of the park that was renovated, for want of a better term, I guess, in recent years. And it provides some of the same information that we've talked about Halfway Brook. From that same time period, we also can travel east to Fort Anne because it was a location where there was a fort actually starting perhaps in the late 17th century. There were a number of forts there, perhaps 5 even. They would be built when people thought they needed protection, and then once peacetime came, they would be allowed to slowly rot into the ground, or the wood would be used for something else. It was located right near where Halfway Brook enters into Wood Creek, sort of on the north end of town. In 1757, Jabez Fitch, which wrote a really actually very interesting account of his activities during the French and Indian War in this area, he reported that he stopped there and he picked strawberries on the parade grounds within what remained of the fort at that time. This is a unique photo in that it shows the sawmill and next to a blockhouse, which had been built there perhaps in 1763. And the most significant event that occurs there actually occurs in July of 1777. At that time, General Burgoyne was pursuing the American troops south from Whitehall, and some of them stopped in here at Fort Anne to mount a defense. And there was protracted battle on a fairly steep hill just north of Fort Anne. And they had to finally give ground, but the delaying action allowed the American troops to get to Saratoga and to set up their defenses and prepare for the bigger battle that would occur there, and ultimately when they were able to defeat the British. I mentioned near the beginning that I heard this story about George Washington stopping at Halfway Brook. That was in July of 1783, when he, along with Governor Clinton of New York, General Alexander Hamilton, Colonel Humphreys and Fisk, and others, were doing a tour of the fortifications across the northern part of the colonies. And they stopped at a brook, which is probably the one that empties from Crandall Park. We don't know for sure. But as the story has it, a local individual who was working in a nearby field, Walter Briggs, brought a pail and cup and supplied water from the brook for them to use to drink. Moving ahead, after the war battles and everything were done, people moved back into the area and to settle it and to develop it. And what I'd like to do in the next few moments is talk about some of the ways that Halfway Brook was harnessed to produce things. The Warren County Atlas, as well as the Washington County Atlas from the 1870s, provide a lot of information about the mills and other industries that were set up along Halfway Brook and its tributaries. And we're going to start out by looking actually quite locally at the story of what happened in Glens Falls. 1864, there's a big fire that burns the entire center of the city. And so the city leaders were well aware of the fact that they needed to find a water source so that they could have the ability to fight future fires. There were numerous ideas, but the one that won out was to pipe water from the mountain west of town into the city. And here you can actually see in this map the line of the Glens Falls water line as it comes in from Wilkie Inlet, which was the first one constructed in 1871. Many people were skeptical that it would work. They had doubts that a gravity-fed system would provide enough water to fight fires, but when they completed it and tried it out, firemen discovered that the water could reach the top of Rockwell House. And they were so enthusiastic that they ended up building a fountain in the center of town, as you see here. The photo on the left actually is from a later time period, I think probably late 19th, early 20th century, when they were putting in an even larger pipe to bring water in from the mountain. Mentioned that the first effort was done in 1871, and they proceeded to construct a number of other dams to capture water along the mountain. Keenan Intake in 1875, they built a storage reservoir for Wilkie in 1878. In 1909, they built Butler Reservoir. And 5 years later, 1914, they added Butler Pond, which we saw earlier. This map here shows, it's from the early 1930s, I believe, shows sort of the complicated nature of the water system that was created, where there are pipes that all come together in a junction, and then that is brought down to the city as a single pipe. In 1836, they added the last major element of the water system, and that's the Halfway Brook Reservoir, located, I'll remember the name of the road, Dixon Road and Old Forge Roads. That makes sense because actually there had been a forge there as early as 1811 that was powered by water coming through Halfway Brook at that point. This map, which was built after the reservoir was created, shows the more complete system, much of which is remains today. Just now we have water tanks and filtration system and such to finish it up. I'd like to talk a little bit about some other industries that were located on the Halfway Brook and its tributaries. Here it shows A. Vermilia's slaughterhouse, which was actually located on a small stream that at that time flowed under Sanford Street, right near where Sanford Street School is currently located. And you'll see that it actually starts near Grove Avenue. And what I was fascinated by is the fact that there was actually a grove there at one time, which would explain the street name. There were other tanneries located. Champlain had one that was located near where Halfway Brook crossed under Glen Street or Route 9. The other thing this map shows, but it's hard to see, is that by this time they already had water hydrants that they'd added on the streets within the city limits at that time period. Nearby was Hovey Pond, which was a source for ice for the area. It was harvested out of the pond and transported across Glenwood Avenue to the storehouse, where it was kept for later distribution. On this map, it shows a number of industries that were built along Halfway Brook through, I would call it, the center of Queensbury. Most popular were sawmills and cider mills. We looked before at Mill Pond in French Mountain, and you can see in the detail from the map here that it powered both a sawmill and provided water for a tannery. There were a number of mills located on the outlet for Glen Lake. In 1782, which was not long after the war had finished, Benedict Brown settled near the outlet of the lake. By the following year, his son Valentine had built a sawmill Robert Moon built another mill just downstream from there. And by 1808, there were 6 mills along the stream. This 1909 report by New York State reported there were still 3 mills located along Halfway Brook, or the Glen Lake outlet. It was interesting the detail this provides. I'd always wondered whether, because the stream was so small that it might get so low in the summer that it would prevent it from being used for power. But they were able to get at least 10 months of use out of the stream, which I thought was fascinating. We mentioned before Factory Hill, where there were mills over time. Chair factory, I believe, at one time. There was also a woolen mill along Glen Lake Outlet. And one of the bigger operation was Jenkins Mill. Palmer Jenkins, with his 4 sons, had a log pond and operated a sawmill, grist mill, and cider mill in the brook near, as it makes sense, what we now call Jenkinsville. He arrived in the area in 1795, and by 1864, his farm included 50 apple trees, and the family grew corn, buckwheat, and oats, thus the need for them to have their own grist mill and cider mill. The sawmill was actually provided services to the entire region, and lots of farmers up and down Ridge Road would bring their lumber to the sawmill to have it sawed. And it actually lasted until 1912. From here, we move into Washington County. First place we encounter is Patton's Mills, which had grist and sawmills. It was interesting, in doing the research on this, I discovered that often the listings for what mills were in a particular place don't necessarily match up with what's on the map. And I suspect what was happening is that their purpose would change over time. Or one would be in business for a period of time, and then, you know, once the lumber got tapped out, they'd have to switch over to something else. Here's a picture of the actual fall in Patton's Mills, which I believe is about 8 feet at times. Griswold Mills, where there are also sawmills and a grist mill and a tannery, as you can see. West Fort Anne had tanneries and sawmills. I don't have any photographs to go with this, but there's another, I guess you could call it a major tributary of Halfway Brook, which actually came down from the northeast. It was referred to as the Podunk Branch. And one of the communities located on that branch was Anchorville, which in that time period was actually very productive. It had a sawmill, plaster mill, clover seed mill, carding machines, a large tannery, 3 forges, and anchor shops. And part of what contributed to that is that in the mountains just north of there was iron ore, which could be mined and then converted into product in these mills. Fort Anne was actually located right where Halfway Brook meets Wood Creek or the Champlain Canal. And I've included this here just so that you can see how things have changed over time. At one time, the earlier canal actually was located to the west, on the west side of the railroad track, whereas now I believe it's all consolidated with Wood Creek on the east side of the track. And you can see vestiges of the locks that were located there in Fort Anne now. Found an interesting note in the history of, in one of the histories of Fort Anne, and that was that in 1816, Due to volcanic eruptions in the summer months, clouds of ash made the air so cold that Halfway Brook froze. Little tidbit thrown in. Haynes Falls was certainly a major player in this area. Originally had been built as a sawmill by Philip Skeen. It's located actually north of Fort Anne Village itself. The mill was used by the Continental Army when they stopped there in their retreat from Whitehall. When they didn't destroy the mill as they departed, the British took it over and used it themselves in preparing for their attack on Saratoga. The falls that are located there actually measure 75 feet, I guess. In addition to powering a sawmill, they also powered a woolen mill, a silex mill, which is basically ground. Now I'm going to forget the mineral. That I won't remember. And a pulp mill. And I think you see two of them in this picture here. It's taken from around the 1880s. Also found recently this wonderful stereo view, which was taken earlier, which I believe probably is of a woolen mill on that location. The story gets more interesting in 1897, when Eugene Ashley starts the Canes Falls Hydroelectric Company. By 1900, he's supplying electricity to Fort Anne, and very shortly after that, he had run wire to Glens Falls so that he could provide power there as well. In 1901, he started the Spire Falls hydroelectric project located west of Glens Falls. But he had actually first got in the electricity business in Fort Anne at Canes Falls. The publication that you see on the left, entitled White Coal of the Adirondacks, was published in 1913. And it was done, I believe, probably so that he could recruit funders for his expansion dreams. Because this publication certainly presents a very grand view of the scope of his project. Here's a picture of the power station. You can see there's a 7-foot diameter penstock, which brought water from the top of the falls down to the power station, which provided the water needed for the turbines. The publication includes a map which shows how extensive his operation was. He had acquired water rights throughout the Halfway Brook, the eastern Halfway Brook watershed, including 13 dams, one of them being Hadlock Pond, which was created in 1896 to provide water for the mills at Canes Falls and the hydroelectric facility. His plan was that the electric lines would supply power not only to Fort Anne, but also to the slate industry in Granville, for farming in Washington County, and as I stated earlier, factories in Glens Falls. He wrote, these juice-laden wires supply many square miles of a rich industrial district and the finest farming section of New York. They also penetrate the state of Vermont to the very heart of the richest slate-bearing region in the world. Electrifying, bringing to life, exclamation point. The hydro plant actually burned in 1960, but there's evidence of the stone foundations. They wouldn't have disappeared so easily, and that evidence of the site's past lingers on. I would mention also that this is private property. The base of the falls, you can go there by boat. People often fish there. But you can't just wonder about the industrial sites. So we have one more topic to talk about, and that's use of Halfway Brook for leisure. As we know, much of the stream is fairly small. It's always been popular for fishing, still is. The trout are well known, brook trout, brown trout, speckled trout you hear about in the past. In 1883, Henry Crandall here in Glens Falls created the park that now bears his name. He had consulted several land holdings there to create this space. And the park includes graded roads that he included for driving his horses. He planted groves of trees and also put in some of the water features that were used for boating. The park was usable by the public. He died in 1911, but had created a trust for care of the park. And it wasn't actually officially transferred to the city of Glens Falls until 1966. Another visionary, Charlie Wood, purchased land along the east side of US 9 between Lake George and Glens Falls. It just so happened to be located where the water flowed out of Rush Pond and headed towards Glen Lake. You see how he incorporated it. The amusement park, Storytown, USA, included a number of things that people could do, like taking rides on the Swan boat. And I'm not sure it shows up here, but they could pass by Little Miller's house, which included a miniature water wheel. To the east is Glen Lake, which was largely off the beaten path until the D&H Railroad ran a track through Lake George that skirted along the western edge of Glen Lake. A couple of years later, that was in 1882, in 1901, a trolley line was put through as well, and it did stop at the lake. The train harvested ice from the lake for its Saratoga line, but to my knowledge, it didn't stop there, however the trolley did, which really opened it up to development as a summer destination. There were a lot of private camps, small resorts and boarding houses that were built up primarily along the northern and western side of the lake, where it was not quite so steep. There were popular places that people could go for dining and dancing. Vandenberg's, which became the Glen Lake Casino. Hotelings, which became Sullivan's, now the Docksider. And if you notice in the lower photograph, you can see the path that went along the edge. That was very important to the culture of the area because people used that to visit their neighbors, to attend festivities at the hotels or the dance halls, and even attend Sunday Mass. Sunnyside, a much smaller body of water to the east of Glen Lake, also had, my order's mixed up here, sorry. Well, I know the story. Here we go. It had a lot of private summer homes around the edges of Lake Sunnyside, but one of the places that was very popular in the area was Carpenter's Pavilion. It was owned by Preston and Bessie Carpenter, and it was frequented by local farmers, factory workers, school and church groups. It was a popular place to go to swim. They had a lighted dock, so you could go there in the evening. You could soap up and enjoy a slide down the two-story slide that you can see here. There was a picnic area where school groups would go and church groups. They also had a dance hall, jukebox, and they sold it in 1955. It continued for another couple decades, but burned in 1986. But it's a place that provided many happy summer memories for people that lived in the area. Going back to Round Pond, the Glens Falls Country Club was founded in 1912. And here you can see they had a bridge that went over to their private beach that could be enjoyed by their members. The Round Pond also had an area that was available to the general public. It went by a variety of names. As you can see here, there was a beach, there was a pier, and a dancing pavilion. I read about a place that was called the Casino, the Round Pond Casino. I'm not sure if it's the same place. There may be people out there that know the details of this. Further to the east and north, I mentioned before how Camp Wackpomony was built on Sly Pond. And that was in 1920 that it opened. Of course, with the beautiful lake there, water activities were available to the boys when they went there. I looked for other things in that area as well. Found this nice period photograph of a camp on Lake Nebo. And then just recently discovered this photograph of Green's Pavilion on Hadlock Pond. I must admit, I don't know anything about it, but it was just so much fun to discover that it was there. Halfway Brook didn't stop being important in the past. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recent issues that are connected with Halfway Brook. And what you see on the left side of the photograph here, this is Hadlock Pond after the new earthen dam that had been built there in 2005 gave out, essentially draining the pond and causing a lot of damage to downstream properties. Took 12 years to resolve all of the lawsuits and determine who was responsible for what and collect money for the damages so that they could not only reimburse people who had suffered from the flooding that ensued, but also reconstruct the dam, which of course after it was built took a little bit of time for the pond to refill. Increasing development along Route 9, the construction of Quaker Road, more building, parking lots and such going up Bay Road meant that there began to be serious problems with stormwater runoff, polluting Halfway Brook and causing physical damage. Also, there were growing problems with endangered plant species, pushing out native plants that contribute to the habitats that were there, and growing concern about the fish population that had always been part of the Halfway Brook story. In 2000, the Warren and Washington County Soil and Water Conservation Districts undertook a study and developed a plan to mitigate a lot of specific problems that they found in different places along Halfway Brook in the two counties. The plan identified several key problem areas in Glens Falls, Queensbury, and Fort Anne. As you can see from these schematics, many of them were identified by certain roads or plazas. As I mentioned, the increasing paved areas meant that there was nothing to slow down stormwater runoff, and it would all just sort of flush into the brook. In 2005, there was a wetland improvement project in Hovey Pond, where they, number one, wanted to address a lot of invasive species that were growing along stream. So they removed a lot of the plant life. They didn't want reintroduced plants that they preferred to have. They added a new walkway and signage about the significance of Halfway Brook. And then actually, I think it was 7 years later, there was another similar project to improve the water quality. And that was at the Meadowbrook Preserve, which now includes a wonderful walkway as well. But again, they introduced native plants that were important to that habitat in the process of doing that project. Now it's a recreational trail. There were some other projects that were addressed the stormwater runoff more directly. They took place basically 2011 and 12. I found information about them. One of which was along Bay Road. A lot of water sort of runs down, runs down Glen Street and into the brook where Route 9 crosses it. So they did some remediation there to try to remove some of the silt that was being carried by the water and slow it down. And another project that you see on the right that was located near the Cool and Shoring property on Quaker Road, again, to try to deal with stormwater runoff. In the late 2000s, the city of Glens Falls entertained the idea of developing some of the lands in their watershed between Dixon Road and Peggy Ann Road. It was quite controversial and contentious, but they did a study to determine what might be good uses for the property, in addition to looking at the idea of developing it for housing. They looked at recreational opportunities that might be presented there. This plan didn't come to anything. Actually, putting things in so close to the water supply was considered too risky for the city's watershed. But in 2020, Halfway Brook Trail System was opened, which provides access to Halfway Brook. You can walk or ski in from either Peggy Ann or Potter Road. And I would point out that the trail essentially cuts straight across the watershed area. And they do ask that you stay on the trail and not be going off in many directions. You'll notice leashed dogs are welcome, but certainly don't really want to see them in the water. That's our drinking water. So please follow the rules that are established for that so we can continue to use it. And along with this vintage photograph of Halfway Brook in Crandall Park, I'd like to read a poem that had been created over 100 years ago by Harriet Bentley. The Halfway Brook. A rill on top of Luzerne Mountain winds in the shade of briar and bracken, trickling o'er rocks through green mossy filters. Over pebbles and roots it sparkles downward, joined by rivulets all tending eastward. Filling a basin with crystal waters, it pours over the rim and never falters, but plunges and leaps from stone and from boulders, then crosses the plains in and out of the alders. This happy brook then merrily winds through the park under fragrant pines, purls under a bridge in wavering lines, then through a green meadow dimples and twines, between flowery banks and trailing vines. But between rushes and bogs it lingers and shines, listening to frogs making runic rhymes. Then over dam it gets into some cogs, turns a wheel and on it jogs. Past Amherst Fort, built for English glory, when British and French strove together for mastery, on these fair banks that are dark with the history of the conflict and suffering of our noble ancestry, but are peaceful now, loved by the sons and the daughters that dwell on your brink and drink of your waters. Flow gently now, for under the willows a boy is fishing in the pool for minnows, and smooth and broad over the sandy shallows, where the cows stand under the bank in the shadows. But and the current grows stronger, rushing swiftly by ground fraught with mystery and horror, passing old gray forts on Champlain's green border, then glides quietly by each Canadian altar to unite with the great St. Lawrence River as onward it sweeps to the Atlantic saltwater. But sometime returns in rain to the fountain and trickles again through the ferns down the mountain. With that, I will close and entertain questions. Any?
I think there was a question in the chat.
Okay.
Publications that you would recommend to revisit the history of Halfway Brook?
Well, I don't think there's a lot written about it in totality, but certainly the military part of its history. Probably the best thing is the publication. Well, it's interesting reading. I'll put it that way. It's early. It doesn't leave out some things that have been discovered since. But the publication that was done for the New York Historical Association in 1905 or 06, it might have been published. You can find that online as a PDF. I think that was the best source that I used initially. I also had some notes that were provided to me by other people that have done research. They're unpublished though. So it's really a matter of discovery. There are books that are written about the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War, which will reference Halfway Brook, but they will only be part of those bigger stories. It was only that group of individuals back in 1805 that thought that it was important to actually focus on doing the research for Halfway Brook, which they used to create the marker. That's the most focused thing that I've found.
I'll come back to the chat questions, but Gloria, you have your hand raised.
I do. What do you think of that? There. Okay. I noticed, were the ponds used in the wintertime, like for skating or for any of ice fishing? Do you know about any of that and how the ponds were used in the winter?
Only thing I read about is people using it for ice.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't think they wrote about it otherwise.
All right. Okay. Curious because they're such nice ponds, and I would think that I mean, I know Glen Lake. I used to skate on Glen Lake, and I'm thinking these other ponds were probably just as nice, I guess.
You could assume that people did it, but it may not have been important enough to make it into somebody's annals.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you.
In the chat, a question was asked. The slide where you have the Halfway Brook marker, do you
Which
know? I think the older photo of the original location of the marker before it was moved. Do you happen to know anything about the house in the photo behind it?
No. Sorry.
And then another question, did Stoddard photograph Halfway Brook? Or do we have any of those?
None come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of surprising, but I can't picture any. I'm not sure to what extent it was well, no. it may not have been enough of a destination that he thought he might have been able to sell it to tourists. He certainly photographed many other bodies of water, but I can't think of any. And a lot of the development occurred after he was done as a photographer too.
Oh,
So
okay. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh. Oh, I think that might be too hard to determine. Was the house the owner of the old ice cutting business? I think that would be too difficult to determine.
I'd have to go back and look and compare it to other photographs that may or may not exist. It sometimes is very hard to even determine what direction you're looking in those photographs, because the landscape has changed so much. At that time, a lot of the trees have been cleared away and now there's trees everywhere, so it's hard to compare. But if there's a similar photograph that might show the same house, that would be helpful. It was interesting at the time they were writing about where the location of the forts were, like the blockhouse and such. They referred to it as being on the location of somebody's house. Well, we don't even know where that house was anymore, which makes it tricky. You know, I'd have to find a map that actually included that house to identify the location of the blockhouse. We can just guess that it's somewhere in that area.
We have another question. Where was the Hovey ice stored, if you know? The barn near the Glens Falls bus
The
barn?
barn that's, okay, I can address that. I don't know exactly where the storehouses were because they no longer stand. The barn that's standing was actually for their horses. I did read, though, that they had to transport it across Glenwood from the pond. That's as much as I know.
Mhm.
I can remember when I was little, we had a boat on Lake George and we had an ice box on the boat. And we used to get ice from a building where the sports page is now. That's where they stored it, right in that area.
That would make sense.
Yeah, it was right. Maybe the foundation is the same, but of course they must have modernized the building. But no, I can remember big chunks of ice, and my father would pick up one, would put in the box for the day, and then put the meat in the ice box and the potato salad and everything. And it would, of course, it would melt, and then you just throw it away, you know.
Thank you.
And I'm in my 70s, so, it wasn't that long ago.
I'd have to actually, one thing that might be a possibility is if we could find some insurance maps that show structures. If they included that area, they would give us an idea. There aren't a lot of photographs around that area. Very few.
Right.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Hi, Tim.
Hi there.
I want to congratulate you on your last official, maybe, program. It was wonderful. All your hard work, not only for this, but over the how many years? 23 years? 23 years. So just wanted to say thank you very much for a wonderful program and for everything that you've done for the museum over all this time. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.
If nobody else has questions or comments, we could wrap it up, but I'm happy to leave it open if anybody else had something. Okay, I'll formally thank all of you for joining us on Zoom this evening. And Tim, just to reiterate what Teresa already said, we wish you the best in retirement. And thank you for all you've done for the museum and the community for the past 23 years. And just to kind of end things, our next talk in this series is going to be held on March 9th on Zoom. And we're going to be hearing about the connection between fashion and women's political rights. So feel free to tune in March. So thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great night.
Yeah, thank you.